You think you know America? Mississippi is a state so unbelievably bizarre, so jaw-droppingly broken, and so shockingly secretive that historians still can't believe half of it actually happened. A man got electrocuted twice by the government and survived. A governor literally stood on the Senate floor and bragged about being a white supremacist and kept getting re-elected. And the state ran an actual secret spy agency on its own citizens for over 20 years. And that's just the appetizer. We found 71 of the most insane, embarrassing, and straight-up dumbest things Mississippi has ever done. And by number 10, you're going to question everything they taught you in history class. Stay until the end because number 71 will completely change how you see American history forever. And before we get into it, if this blows your mind even a little, hit that hype button right now and send this to someone who thinks they know everything about America. Let's see how fast we can break their brain together. 1. Nobody remembered to file the paperwork. For 148 years, Mississippi quietly walked around pretending it had abolished slavery like every other state while the actual ratification documents sat unfiled in some forgotten government drawer. A random clerk discovered the mistake in 2013, and the entire country stopped and stared. The state that made slavery its whole personality somehow never officially ended it on paper. Not for a decade, not for a century, but for 148 embarrassing years. 2. Now apparently, just being a state was not enough for Mississippi, so it built its own secret spy agency to stalk its own citizens. From 1956 to 1977, the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission paid real government informants to follow black residents and civil rights workers around like some low-budget Cold War thriller happening inside American borders. State officials funded it. State officials ran it. Mississippi constructed an entire domestic surveillance machine and genuinely believed this was a completely reasonable use of taxpayer money. 3. The last Confederate battle flag flying over an official American state did not come down until 2020, and that state was exactly who you think it was. Mississippi held onto its Confederate emblem on the official state flag through decades of national embarrassment, corporate boycotts, and relentless pressure from its own citizens. It took a global racial justice movement in 2020 to finally force the state's hand. Mississippi did not lead. Mississippi did not volunteer. Mississippi got dragged into the modern era, kicking and screaming like a toddler losing a toy. 4. Every single state in America ended Prohibition in 1933 when the rest of the country collectively decided alcohol was legal again. Mississippi looked at that decision and said absolutely not. The state kept alcohol completely illegal for another 33 years, making it the last dry state in the entire nation. Mississippi finally legalized drinking in 1966, which means for 3 full decades after Prohibition ended nationally, Mississippi residents were technically criminals for cracking open a beer in their own homes. 5. When federal courts told Mississippi it had to let black and white children attend the same schools, some districts came up with a truly spectacular solution. They simply closed the schools entirely. Not for a week, not for a month, but for years. White families quietly enrolled their children in private academies funded by the same community while black children were left with nothing. Mississippi looked at the choice between integration and education and decided neither was acceptable if it meant sharing a classroom. 6. Willie Francis was 17 years old when Mississippi strapped him into the electric chair in 1947, and the chair simply did not finish the job. The execution failed. Willie survived. And instead of any reasonable person stepping in, the United States Supreme Court ruled Louisiana could try again. So the same teenager was dragged back to the same chair and electrocuted a second time by the same state. America watched this happen, and the legal system called it constitutional without blinking once. 7. Doctors did not name the stroke belt as a joke. So they named it because a specific region of the American South produces stroke deaths at rates so dramatically higher than the rest of the country that medical researchers needed a geographic label for the crisis. Mississippi sits right at the buckle of that belt, holding the highest stroke death rate in the entire nation. The state leads America in obesity, leads America in poverty, and leads America in sending its residents to early graves from entirely preventable cardiovascular events. 8. Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam murdered 14-year-old Emmett Till in Mississippi in 1955 and walked out of the courtroom free men after an all-white jury deliberated for just 67 minutes. Then in 1956, both men sat down with a national magazine and confessed every single detail of the murder to a journalist in print for the entire country to read. They could not be retried because double jeopardy protected them completely. They confessed to murdering a child, and America could do absolutely nothing about it. 9. There is poor, and then there is Mississippi poor. For over 50 consecutive years, economic analysts, federal agencies, and independent researchers have ranked Mississippi as the single poorest state in the entire United States of America. Not occasionally, not in a bad decade. Every single year for more than half a century, Mississippi has finished last. Federal aid programs have poured billions into the state, and the gap between Mississippi and the rest of America has barely moved in 2 generations of trying. 10. The blues did not come from Chicago. It did not come from New York. It was born in the muddy fields of the Mississippi Delta by black musicians who turned suffering into the most influential American art form ever created. That music went on to inspire rock and roll, soul, jazz, and rhythm and blues heard on every continent on Earth. Mississippi celebrated this extraordinary cultural gift by waiting until 2015 to open a proper blues museum. A full century after the music changed the world. 11. Mississippi did not earn the title of most obese state in America once and move on. The state has held that distinction for most of the past 2 decades, running like it is defending a championship nobody wants. Nearly 4 in 10 Mississippi adults are clinically obese, which puts enormous strain on a healthcare system that is already underfunded, understaffed, and stretched beyond its limits. Mississippi leads the nation in obesity while simultaneously ranking last in the resources needed to actually treat the consequences of that crisis. 12. Mississippi politicians love to talk about independence, self-reliance, and keeping the federal government out of state business. Then the checks arrive. For every single dollar Mississippi residents pay in federal taxes, the state pulls back over $3 in federal spending, making it one of the most federally dependent states in the entire country. Without Washington money, Mississippi's budget would collapse almost immediately. The state that screams loudest about government overreach survives almost entirely because of government money flowing in from everywhere else. 13. In Mississippi, any person can walk out of their house carrying a loaded handgun in plain sight without a permit, without training, and without any background check required by state law. No class, no license, no questions asked. Mississippi calls this freedom. Public health researchers call it a public safety crisis. The state has among the highest gun death rates in America, which is a remarkable achievement for a place that simultaneously has some of the lowest population density in the entire country. 14. So every year, American students sit down for national standardized reading and math assessments, and every year Mississippi children finish at or near the absolute bottom of every single category measured. This is not a new trend or a recent development. Mississippi has been posting some of the worst education scores in the country for decades straight. The state underpays its teachers, underfunds its schools, and then expresses genuine confusion about why its children cannot compete academically with students from states that actually invest in classrooms. 15. Women earned the constitutional right to vote in America in 1920, when the 19th Amendment became federal law. Mississippi looked at that historic moment and decided it wanted no part of it. So the state refused to ratify the amendment for 64 more years, finally offering its symbolic approval in 1984, when the gesture meant absolutely nothing legally. Mississippi was the very last state in the country to ratify women's suffrage, which is an incredible achievement for a state that has had female voters since 1920 regardless of its opinion. 16. Jackson is the capital city of Mississippi, and since 2022, it has been unable to reliably provide its own residents with safe drinking water. Pipes burst, treatment plants failed. Hundreds of thousands of people went weeks at a time without water they could safely drink or use to bathe. This was not a hurricane aftermath. This was not a natural disaster. And this was decades of neglected infrastructure finally collapsing under the weight of complete governmental indifference in a majority black city that kept asking for help and kept getting ignored. 17. Three of the most recognizable human beings on the entire planet came from Mississippi. Elvis Presley, who invented a whole new relationship between America and popular music. Oprah Winfrey, who built a media empire from nothing and became one of the most powerful people in the world. Jim Henson, who gave the planet Kermit the Frog and the Muppets. All three born in Mississippi. All three became global icons. Mississippi remains one of the least visited states in America, which is honestly impressive given that resume. 18. Three young civil rights workers named James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner drove into Mississippi in the summer of 1964 and never came home. They were abducted, beaten, and murdered. When investigators started digging into who organized the ambush, they found a local sheriff's deputy had not just looked the other way, but had actively helped plan and coordinate the attack. A law enforcement officer used his badge and his position to help murder 3 Americans for trying to register voters. 19. Mississippi's state constitution contained a clause explicitly banning atheists from holding any public office in the state. A person could be a convicted felon who had served their time, rehabilitated, and rebuilt their life and potentially face fewer legal barriers to public office than someone who simply did not believe in God. But this clause sat in the written Constitution for over a century, staring back at anyone who cared to read it as a monument to exactly what kind of government Mississippi intended to run. 20. Fortune 500 companies represent the economic backbone of American business, and every single state in the country hosts at least one major corporate headquarters except one. Mississippi has 0 Fortune 500 companies. Not one major corporation has chosen to anchor itself in the state, despite decades of tax incentives, low wages, and business-friendly legislation. Mississippi has tried almost everything to attract large employers, and the result after all that effort is the same empty answer it started with, which is absolutely nothing at all. 21. History books remember Hiram Revels as a groundbreaking figure because in 1870, Mississippi sent him to Washington as the first Black United States Senator in American history. That moment represented something genuinely extraordinary for a country still bleeding from the Civil War. Then, Mississippi spent the next 130 years making sure it never happened again. The state that accidentally made history by doing the right thing once spent over a century working extremely hard to make sure that particular accident would not repeat itself. 22. Teaching is one of the most demanding professions in America, and Mississippi has found a creative way to reward that dedication by paying its teachers so little that many of them qualify for federal food assistance programs while actively employed full-time in a classroom. While Mississippi teachers' salaries rank among the absolute lowest in the entire nation. The state asks its educators to show up every day, manage overcrowded classrooms, and inspire underfunded students while simultaneously making sure those same teachers cannot afford a comfortable life doing it. 23. Mississippi's public pension system exists to protect thousands of government workers who spent entire careers serving the state, with the promise of a secure retirement waiting at the end. That promise is currently backed by a fund with a multi-billion-dollar shortfall, making it one of the worst-funded public pension systems in the entire country. Teachers, police officers, and state employees who dedicated decades to Mississippi are now watching the financial foundation underneath their retirement quietly crumble while state legislators argue about what to do next. 24. Somewhere in Mississippi, there is a town called So-So, with a population of under 500 people, and absolutely nobody can agree on where that name came from. Local historians have been debating the origin for generations and have produced zero consensus. Some say it described the town's unremarkable quality. Others have completely different theories. The argument has never been resolved. So-So sits quietly in Jones County, being exactly as ambiguous as its name suggests, while the rest of America remains completely unaware it exists at all. 25. BB. King did not grow up in Memphis or Chicago or any of the cities people associate with the blues. He was born in Itta Bena, Mississippi, a town so small and so removed from mainstream American geography that it does not appear on most standard road maps. From that invisible dot on the Mississippi Delta map came one of the most celebrated guitarists in the history of recorded music. A man the entire world called the King of the Blues started his life in a place most Americans cannot find. 26. Between 1882 and 1968, Mississippi recorded over 500 documented lynchings of black citizens, making it the deadliest state in America for racially motivated mob violence by a significant margin. These were not secret events hidden from public view. They were often announced in advance, attended by crowds, and sometimes photographed as souvenirs. Law enforcement frequently stood by and watched or participated directly. Mississippi did not just tolerate this violence for nearly a century. In many documented cases, the state actively facilitated it without consequence. 27. Mississippi wanted casino gambling money, but did not want actual casinos sitting on its soil, so lawmakers came up with a solution that perfectly captures how Mississippi operates. Gambling would only be legal on floating riverboats. So casino developers took enormous barges, bolted them permanently and completely immovably to the riverbank, declared them floating vessels, and the state of Mississippi looked at this arrangement and said that counts. See, Mississippi created a legal fiction so obvious and so absurd that the entire American gambling industry used it as a blueprint. 28. The gap between what Mississippi households earn and what the average American household earns is roughly $20,000 per year. That is not a rounding error or a statistical quirk. That is a structural economic canyon that has existed for decades and has barely narrowed despite billions of dollars in federal assistance flowing into the state since the 1980s. Mississippi residents work, pay taxes, and raise families while earning significantly less than almost every other American doing the exact same things in almost every other state. 29. During the 1960 presidential election, Mississippi's Electoral College electors decided that neither John F. Kennedy nor Richard Nixon was acceptable and cast their votes for an unpledged segregationist slate instead. Mississippi did not accidentally wander into this protest. State officials deliberately organized it as a political statement against federal civil rights pressure. In the middle of a Cold War presidential election, Mississippi's electors looked at two major party candidates and chose a third option specifically designed to signal that the state had no intention of accepting racial equality. 30. James Meredith simply wanted to attend the University of Mississippi in 1962. The university said no because he was black. Federal courts said yes. Mississippi Governor Ross Barnett personally blocked the entrance. President John F. Kennedy responded by mobilizing 30,000 federal troops and sending them to Oxford, Mississippi, to escort one student onto a college campus. Riots broke out. 2 people died. Mississippi turned a college enrollment into a military operation, rather than allow a single black man to sit in one of its classrooms. 31. Federal bridge inspectors do not hand out structural deficiency ratings as a compliment. When they flag a bridge, it means the structure beneath the vehicles crossing it every single day is failing in ways that could become catastrophic without serious intervention. Nearly 1/3 of all bridges in Mississippi carry that exact rating, making it one of the worst infrastructure states in the entire country. Mississippi residents drive over crumbling bridges daily, not because they have no choice, but because the state has spent decades choosing not to fix them. 32. Mississippi has more churches per capita than any other state in America. More churches than Texas. More churches than the entire Bible Belt combined on a per-person basis. This extraordinary concentration of religious observance exists alongside the highest teen pregnancy rate in the nation, significant gambling addiction numbers, and some of the country's worst violent crime statistics. Mississippi is simultaneously the most churched and some of the most troubled state in America, which raises questions that Mississippi's considerable religious community has not yet found comfortable answers to. 33. In 1967, Bobby Gentry released a haunting song called Ode to Billy Joe, set on a real bridge spanning the Tallahatchie River in Mississippi. The song became a massive hit, and America spent years arguing about what Billy Joe threw off that bridge before jumping. Bobby Gentry never told anyone. She took the secret to her retirement. The actual Tallahatchie Bridge collapsed in 1972, taking whatever symbolic answer it held with it into the water. Mississippi now has a historical marker for a mystery nobody ever officially solved. 34. Byron de la Beckwith shot Medgar Evers in the driveway of his own home in Jackson, Mississippi, on June 12, 1963, while Evers' wife and children were inside. Beckwith was tried twice, and both times all-white juries deadlocked and walked him free. He spent the next 3 decades living openly in Mississippi, attending social events and giving speeches. In 1994, a third trial finally convicted him 31 years after the murder. Medgar Evers' family waited longer for justice than most Americans wait for anything in their entire lives. 35. After the Civil War ended in 1865, Mississippi had 146 years to pass a hate crime law, adding extra legal consequences for racially motivated violence. The state declined every single opportunity until 2011. For nearly a century and a half, racially motivated murders, assaults, and terroristic threats carried 0 additional legal weight under Mississippi state law. A person could target a victim specifically because of their race, and Mississippi's legal system would treat it identically to any other crime until well into the 21st century arrived. 36. Remove the federal military installations from Mississippi and entire counties lose their only meaningful economic engine. Fort Moore, the Naval Air Station in Meridian, and other federal bases do not just employ workers in Mississippi. They are the economy in the regions surrounding them. Without that federal military spending flowing directly into those communities, the tax base evaporates, businesses close, and populations collapse. Mississippi routinely elects politicians who campaign against federal spending while their own districts survive almost entirely because federal spending shows up in uniform every morning. 37. Our Theodore Bilbo served Mississippi in the United States Senate and did not attempt to disguise or soften his beliefs for polite company. He called himself a white supremacist openly on the Senate floor. He used racial slurs in official speeches. He proposed legislation to deport all Black Americans to Africa. He wrote a book promoting racial segregation. Mississippi voters heard all of this clearly and kept sending him back to Washington anyway. Bilbo was not a fringe embarrassment Mississippi tolerated. He was a repeated, deliberate choice its voters made. 38. Kindergarten is not a radical educational concept. Most American states mandated it as a standard part of public education decades before Mississippi got around to it. The state did not require kindergarten statewide until 2006, making it one of the absolute last places in the country to acknowledge that 5-year-olds benefit from structured early education. While other states were building on decades of kindergarten foundations and measuring the long-term academic benefits, Mississippi was still debating whether the whole idea was even necessary in the first place. 39. There are rural communities in Mississippi in 2024 where residents open their laptops and connect to the internet at speeds slower than what a standard dial-up modem delivered to American households back in the early 2000s. Not slightly slower, genuinely comparable to the screeching connection speeds that predated broadband by a generation. Mississippi has some of the worst rural internet infrastructure in the entire developed world. And the consequences are enormous, affecting everything from remote work possibilities to children trying to complete basic school homework assignments at home. 40. Every other state in America operates on a straightforward principle where the candidate who receives the most votes wins the election. Mississippi decided that was too simple. Thanks to a Jim Crow-era provision still embedded in the state constitution, a governor can lose the statewide popular vote and still win the election if they carry enough individual legislative districts. This rule was not designed for fairness or efficiency. It was specifically engineered to dilute Black voting power, and Mississippi has never bothered to remove it from the books. 41. Jim Henson became one of the most beloved creative minds in American entertainment history, and the origin story of his most famous character starts in a swamp in Mississippi. As a child growing up in Leland, Henson caught frogs along the local waterways, and those specific Mississippi Delta frogs became the direct physical inspiration for Kermit. The town of Leland took this connection seriously enough to build an entire museum dedicated to a green felt frog whose existence traces directly back to a Mississippi childhood nobody outside the state ever talks about. 42. The summer of 1964 in Mississippi was not a summer. It was a coordinated campaign of terror directed at American citizens on American soil. 37 churches were bombed or burned to the ground. Over 1,000 volunteers were physically assaulted. 4 workers were murdered. And throughout all of it, local law enforcement in Mississippi largely stood aside, looked the other way, and in documented cases actively assisted the people carrying out the violence. The federal government had to treat an American state like hostile territory to get anything done. 43. Mississippi did not accidentally create a racist constitution in 1890. The men who wrote it stood up in the official record and bragged about exactly what they were doing. They designed poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses with one specific purpose, which was stripping black citizens of the voting rights they had earned after the Civil War. They said this openly in the documented proceedings of the Constitutional Convention. Mississippi built a legal architecture of disenfranchisement, and its architects were proud enough to put their reasoning in writing for history to read. 44. Wyoming is a landlocked state sitting in the middle of the American West with no beaches, no coastline, no tropical weather, and roughly 1/3 of Mississippi's total population. Wyoming also generates more tourism revenue than Mississippi. Mississippi has the Gulf Coast. Mississippi has the Mississippi River. Mississippi has the Delta, the Blues Trail, antebellum history, and some of the most culturally significant geography in America. And yet a state famous primarily for being empty and cold pulls more tourist dollars annually than Mississippi manages with all of that. 45. And South Carolina is usually the state that gets credit for firing the first shots of secession, but Mississippi was right behind it, moving so fast that only one day separated the two declarations. Mississippi filed its official secession paperwork in January 1861, making it the second state to formally leave the United States. The state did not hesitate, did not deliberate long, and did not wait to see how events unfolded. Mississippi decided the Confederacy was worth fighting for before almost anyone else, and history recorded exactly how that decision ended. 46. Reading is not an advanced skill. It is the foundational requirement for navigating modern life, understanding a lease agreement, following medical instructions, or helping a child with homework. And in some rural Mississippi counties, functional adult literacy hovers around 60%, meaning nearly 4 out of every 10 adults struggle to read a standard everyday document. This is not a historical statistic from a century ago. This is the current reality in American communities in the 21st century, inside a state that has had public schools for generations. 47. Mississippi wanted a Toyota manufacturing plant badly enough to offer the company an incentive package worth roughly $500 million in state money, tax breaks, and infrastructure investment. Toyota accepted, built the plant, and created jobs. Then analysts actually ran the numbers and calculated that at the rate tax revenue would flow back to the state, it would take over 40 years just to break even on the original investment. Mississippi essentially paid $500 million for a jobs program that will not pay for itself until sometime around 2050. 48. In every other state in America, judges are either appointed through a merit-based process or elected in nonpartisan races specifically to create at least the appearance of impartiality on the bench. Mississippi looks at that concept and rejects it completely. Mississippi elects its judges on partisan ballots with each candidate's political party printed right next to their name for every voter to see. This is the only state in the country that does this, and the conflicts of interest it creates between judicial decisions and political loyalty are both obvious and thoroughly documented. 49. At the intersection of two highways in Clarksdale, Mississippi, stands one of the most mythologized spots in American musical history. This is where bluesman Robert Johnson supposedly walked to the crossroads at midnight and traded his soul to the devil in exchange for guitar mastery so supernatural it changed the entire direction of American music. Whether Johnson believed it himself, nobody knows. But the legend embedded itself so deeply into American culture that Mississippi eventually put an official state historical marker at the intersection of a deal allegedly made with Satan. 50. The Civil War ended in 1865, and freedom was supposed to mean freedom. Mississippi looked at that arrangement and immediately passed a series of laws called Black Codes designed to recreate slavery through legal language instead of chains. Unemployed black men were arrested under vagrancy laws, convicted in rapid proceedings, and their labor was then auctioned off to white landowners through the Convict leasing system. The Confederacy lost the war, and Mississippi responded by rebuilding the economic structure of slavery inside the criminal justice system, before the ink on the peace agreement had even dried. 51. Mississippi voters went to the ballot box in 2020 and approved legalizing medical marijuana by a clear and convincing majority. The people spoke. The vote was counted. The result was certified. Then the Mississippi Supreme Court stepped in and threw the entire election result in the trash, ruling that the ballot initiative process used to put the measure before voters was technically based on outdated population law. Mississippi residents voted to legalize medical marijuana, and their own state Supreme Court responded by explaining that the vote simply did not count. 52. Child poverty is not an abstraction. It means children going to school hungry, families choosing between medicine and groceries, and kids growing up without the basic stability that makes learning possible. In Mississippi, roughly 1 in 3 children lives below the federal poverty line, making it the highest child poverty rate in the entire United States. Not one of the highest. The highest. Mississippi has held this distinction for years, while simultaneously electing officials who consistently oppose the federal assistance programs that represent the only meaningful financial lifeline those children have. 53. James Eastland represented Mississippi in the United States Senate for decades and used his chairmanship of the Senate Judiciary Committee like a one-man blockade against American progress. For 22 consecutive years, Eastland single-handedly prevented every major civil rights bill from reaching a floor vote by simply refusing to let legislation move through his committee. One senator from Mississippi, sitting in one powerful chair for 22 years, managed to delay the legal protections of millions of American citizens while collecting a government salary the entire time he did it. 54. Head Start was a federal program built on a straightforward idea that poor children deserve early education support to give them a fighting chance before they enter kindergarten. Mississippi received federal funding for the program, and state officials in the 1960s responded by actively working to prevent black children from accessing it. They did not quietly ignore the program. They deliberately sabotaged it. Mississippi took federal money designed to help its poorest, most vulnerable children and spent energy making sure the children who needed it most could not walk through the door. 55. Jackson, Mississippi was once a functioning American city with neighborhoods, tax revenue, municipal services, and a growing population. Then, over 3 decades, it lost more than 35% of its total residents as white flight gutted the tax base and left behind a majority black city with crumbling infrastructure and no financial foundation to fix it. The population collapse created a municipal death spiral, where fewer residents meant less revenue, which meant worse services, which drove out more residents. Jackson did not decline randomly. It was systematically abandoned and then blamed for the abandonment. 56. Every state needs an official song, and Mississippi's choice until 1962 was a tune called Go Mississippi, which managed the remarkable achievement of being so thoroughly mediocre that the state legislators who were supposed to be proud of it stood up on the official Senate floor and called it embarrassing in recorded debate. Politicians whose entire job involves avoiding controversy could not bring themselves to defend their own state song in public. My Mississippi kept playing it at official functions anyway for years, while its own government openly admitted they were embarrassed by it. 57. Rock and roll arrived in America during the 1950s, and several Mississippi counties decided the best governmental response was to ban it from jukeboxes entirely. Local officials did not just dislike the music personally. They stood up publicly and declared that rock and roll was a deliberate communist strategy specifically engineered to corrupt the moral foundations of American youth. Mississippi officials looked at teenagers dancing to rhythm and blues records and concluded the Soviet Union was somehow responsible. The Cold War was apparently being fought one jukebox at a time in rural Mississippi. 58. The Ku Klux Klan operated through terror and violence, but in Mississippi in 1954, a different organization emerged that preferred a more businesslike approach to maintaining white supremacy. The White Citizens Council was founded that year and filled its membership with bankers, lawyers, doctors, and businessmen who understood that economic power was more effective than burning crosses. They fired black employees, denied loans, canceled insurance policies, and destroyed livelihoods. The council gave racial terrorism a suit and tie, and Mississippi's professional class joined it enthusiastically and in enormous numbers. 59. Long after the Civil War ended, and long after slavery was officially abolished, Mississippi was still operating a system that functioned almost identically to slavery in every practical sense. Black men were arrested on flimsy vagrancy charges, processed through rapid court proceedings, and then leased out to private farms and businesses where they worked in shackles for zero wages with no ability to leave. The state collected fees from the arrangement. Private landowners got free labor. And the men trapped inside the system had no meaningful legal recourse available to them at all. 60. Mississippi politicians have spent generations positioning the state as a low-tax business-friendly alternative to higher-tax northern states. The state has never maintained an income tax bracket higher than 5% for most of its modern history, which sounds appealing until you examine what that philosophy actually produces. Mississippi perpetually underfunds its schools, its roads, its hospitals, and its public health infrastructure compared to almost every peer state in the country. Mississippi chose low taxes and got exactly what low taxes buy, which turns out to be not very much at all. 61. Adelbert Ames arrived in Mississippi after the Civil War as a Union war hero who genuinely believed Reconstruction could build something better in the defeated South. As Mississippi's first post-Civil War governor, he championed black civil rights, pushed for integrated institutions, and tried to build a government that served everyone. Mississippi responded by organizing a coordinated white terrorist campaign that made governing impossible and forced him out of office in 1876 before his term ended. Mississippi ran out its best governor through organized violence and called it a political victory. 62. I separate but equal was always a lie, but Mississippi did not even bother maintaining the equal part of that fiction. In some Mississippi counties, the per-pupil spending ratio between white schools and black schools was literally 10-to-1. White children received $10 of educational investment for every single dollar spent on a black child, sitting in a crumbling, underfunded schoolhouse nearby. This was not an accident of budgeting or an oversight in accounting. It was a deliberate and sustained policy of educational deprivation enforced by the state for generations. 63. Mississippi needed a modern system to distribute welfare assistance to its poorest residents, so the state hired a private contractor and paid them millions of dollars to operate a welfare debit card program. The contractor accepted the money, ran the program, and was later discovered to have defrauded Mississippi of tens of millions in federal TANF funds meant for the state's most vulnerable families. Mississippi handed public money to a private company to help poor people, and the private company helped itself instead, while Mississippi's poorest residents waited for assistance that was being stolen. 64. Mississippi hosts an annual sweet potato festival, celebrating a crop so deeply embedded in the state's agricultural identity that it became a cultural institution worth commemorating every year. The festival draws crowds, celebrates heritage, and honors the sweet potato as a symbol of Mississippi's farming roots. Meanwhile, the actual sweet potatoes served and celebrated at that festival are increasingly imported from North Carolina because Mississippi's own sweet potato farming industry collapsed decades ago. Mississippi throws a party every year for a crop it largely stopped growing a generation back. 65. Hartley Peavy was a teenager in Meridian, Mississippi, with no formal engineering training, no college degree, no industry connections, and no obvious path into the professional music equipment business. He built his first guitar amplifier anyway, founded the Peavy Electronics Corporation, and eventually put his equipment on stages used by some of the biggest rock bands on the planet. The company that became a global standard in concert amplification started in a small Mississippi town because one self-taught kid refused to accept that his geography determined his ceiling. 66. 144 years after the Civil War ended and slavery was abolished, Mississippi's state legislature got around to formally apologizing for slavery in 2009. The apology arrived as a non-binding resolution, meaning it carried zero legal weight, required zero financial commitment, and obligated the state to do absolutely nothing different going forward. Mississippi waited a century and a half to say sorry, and then made sure the sorry came with no consequences attached to it whatsoever. The apology was historic in timing and completely empty in substance. 67. When federal courts ordered Mississippi to desegregate its schools, the state legislature did not quietly comply, or even openly resist. It passed laws. Over 30 separate pieces of legislation were written, debated, and signed specifically designed to obstruct, delay, and nullify federal court desegregation orders. Mississippi turned obstruction into a legislative agenda and called it massive resistance. The state spent enormous governmental energy passing laws whose sole stated purpose was making sure black children could not attend the same schools as white children regardless of what federal courts had to say about it. 68. Mississippi is statistically the most religiously observant state in America, with church attendance, religious affiliation, and expressions of faith ranking higher there than anywhere else in the country. It is also a state where sin taxes on tobacco, alcohol, and casino gambling fund a disproportionately large share of the annual state budget. Mississippi's government runs on money generated by the very behaviors its overwhelmingly religious population officially opposes. The state preaches against vice every Sunday and then quietly depends on vice revenue to keep the lights on in the Capitol building every Monday. 69. In 1956, Mississippi's state legislature passed a law making it a felony for any public official to comply with the Supreme Court's school desegregation ruling. Read that again slowly. Mississippi passed a law that made obeying a federal court order a criminal act punishable by prosecution. The state did not just resist federal authority through political statements or public protests. It criminalized compliance itself. Mississippi told its own officials that following the law of the land would get them arrested, and enough legislators voted yes to make that threat official state policy. 70. Mississippi calls itself the Magnolia State and plasters the magnolia tree across its official branding, its state symbols, and its cultural identity with enormous pride. The magnolia tree is not originally from Mississippi. It is not originally from America. The magnolia is native to China and Asia and arrived in the American South through botanical trade routes long before the state existed. Mississippi adopted the magnolia as its defining symbol during the height of Confederate political branding, which means the state's most cherished emblem of Southern identity is actually an immigrant from the other side of the planet. 71. Muddy Waters did not just influence American music. He invented the electric blues sound that directly inspired the Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, and essentially the entire architecture of rock and roll as the world came to know it. His real name was McKinley Morganfield, and he was born in Rolling Fork, Mississippi, a small delta town that produced one of the most consequential musicians in human history. Mississippi gave Muddy Waters nothing during his lifetime. No recognition, no ceremony, no acknowledgement. The state ignored the man who helped create the soundtrack of the modern world. And that is Mississippi, a state that forgot to abolish slavery for 148 years, banned rock and roll to fight communism, and throws a festival for a crop it stopped growing. So here's the question. Which one of these facts genuinely broke your brain the most? Drop it in the comments right now. And if you want more of the dumbest, weirdest, most unbelievable facts about every state in America, hit subscribe on Dumbest Things, because we are just getting started.